I'm delighted to welcome you all to this session called The Living City, where we're going to be as mischievous and feisty as possible. We have a delightful panel for you, which I'll introduce in a second. The first thing to say is that we want this to be quite convivial and do a little bit of thinking and philosophizing together, which means that anytime that you have a question, feel free to go ahead and raise your hand in the middle, and then as soon as it feels fluid, to be able to integrate you into the conversation, then we can. We've got mic runners that'll be running throughout the whole session. So I'm Sam Kimbrell. I direct the Philosophy and Society program here at Aspen, and our goal is to really press into primary first principle questions that sit right beneath all of these other larger policy and political issues that we're dealing with. So in this session, we're going to be trying to work out the relationship between nature and culture. And we've got a delightful panel who are all going to tell you about their kind of very diverse and quite interesting experiments in that area. So I'll go ahead and introduce quickly. So on the far left, Sika Stevens is building the first eco-city off the coast of Africa in Sierra Leone. Yeah. And it's a genuinely delightful and innovative project in a way that I haven't come across in other cases. Jill Koski is the president and CEO of the Morton Arboretum here in Chicago, and thinks very, very carefully about what their mission is in relation to a larger urban area. And then Naomi Davis is author, lovely, of 8 Principles of Green Village Building, and also the Sustainable Square Mile System, both of which have this kind of really pressing right at the front of how our relationship between nature and culture works. I want to start the conversation this way. There's a famous essay from the 80s by someone called Jared Diamond called "The Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race." And that mistake, he says, is agriculture. So he says, recent archaeological discoveries suggest that the adaptation of agriculture, supposedly our most decisive step forward toward a better life, was in many ways a catastrophe from which our race has never recovered. With agriculture came gross social and sexual inequality, disease and despotism, and all of the other curses that haunt our current existence. So the argument of the piece is that there was a period where humanity had a much more deeply integrated relationship to nature. And in particular, he says, if you think about the history of our species, on the full time span, we've had roughly 100,000 years of being hunter-gatherers, and then now 7,000 to 9,000 years of this other quite insane system that's bringing us to the brink of extinction. And the idea is you set out these lines in your fields between cities and nature, between the bush, the woodlands, the wild, and then what counts as society, culture, other stuff. To come here, I spent the summers in Colorado, where I grew up in the mountains, and go for backcountry runs where there's bears, and I carry a pepper spray thing and whatever, and then get on this magic tin tube thing that shoots me through the sky into a place that looks like this, where it's perfectly defined angles. We may have some decoration that looks like nature, but in all practical purposes, we sort of know, oh wait, now we're in society rather than in nature. So that's the question that we want to be pushing at through this. Is our illustrious feisty commentator from the 80s actually right that we've made profound, difficult mistakes in this kind of delineation between nature and culture? Or is there some way to kind of imagine how we might integrate our lives in a fashion that doesn't have some of the mistakes of this sharp nature versus culture division, but actually is able to kind of bring something lively and innovative to the surface? So that's where I turn to the genuinely wise people on this topic, and start working out all kinds of alternative models that we can go through. So Naomi, I'd love to start with you. Tell me a little bit about the work you're doing and have done now have been genuinely the forefront of some of this innovation for a long time.
Yeah, well, first of all, I've got to give props to my ancestors. I'm the proud granddaughter of Mississippi sharecroppers. who, like millions of others, voted with their feet and moved up south
Yeah.
for freedom and economic opportunity. And the lore of life on the farm was so embedded in my family. Literally, the last two things I ever heard my mother say before she passed was, the farm, the farm. And so growing up with an appreciation, everything they ate, they grew.
Yeah.
Everything they wore, they made, and they thought they were poor. In fact, they were rich. They had a relationship of stewardship with the land. And of course, sharecropping could be a very pernicious system. It wasn't so much the case with my grandparents, but the idea that there was a way to live in harmony and mutuality with the land was a concept I grew up with. Now, I grew up in New York City. And the idea that the walk to work, walk to shop, walk to learn, walk to play village that I grew up in, we have fast forward to now looked at how we could reinvent here in the age of climate crisis. And so for me, it was fundamental for Blacks in Green to find a new way forward with horticulture. And I use the umbrella phrase because it includes us. We have what we call the West Woodlawn Botanic Garden, Village Farm, and Arboretum. My friend here from Morton, without whom we would not be positioned to achieve Arboretum status. But we've planted over 400 trees in the neighborhood. We all know
Where is this?
West Woodlawn, Chicago, South Lakefront.
Cool.
And what we know from our experience, if we can slow down for a second, is we understand you feel well around a wood. And I spent 5 miserable years in South Carolina where the only thing, and the light bulb moment, and the value of me suffering through it was for me to rediscover how much I felt well in the land. And, you know, hospitals, which are surrounded by woods, report that people heal better and faster when they have a view of the woods. And so I give you all this background to say that it was absolutely fundamental to creating the sustainable square mile, that walk to work, walk to shop, walk to learn, walk to play village, that we would have a land stewardship approach. And as a matter of fact, we were so broke when we first started out that really creating garden spaces was the only thing we could do. We could do it visibly, we could do it beneficially, we could do it in a way that we knew that we could manage it somehow on our own. So we started with what we call the 16 Great Migration Gardens of West Woodlawn. Yes, bringing heritage. Yes, bringing African-American traditions into the process. We put a big sign out, welcome to historic West Woodlawn, a Great Migration legacy community. And in everything that we've done since then, we've endeavored to bring that sense of harmony. So here in the age of climate crisis, it's, you know, how many households can we feed locally? Y'all remember the advent of the food desert per se. How many jobs and businesses can we create? There's an economic model that needs to be involved. How many neighbors can we train and engage? Our first initiative was the backyard garden. We were gonna do 100 backyard gardens in 2013, and we did 2. But it never left our hearts that people ought to be able to experience the glory of growing food, watching a seed come up, eating something that was healthy. And lastly, how many gallons of stormwater could we divert? So that's the West Woodlawn Botanic Garden, Village Farm, and Arboretum, and the system of the sustainable square mile, which revolves around really creating a new narrative for Black communities in America that are beautiful, prosperous, comfortable, and joyous. And so these elements we're baking in throughout throughout our walkable village.
I mean, one of the things that really struck me in what you're saying is something that initially feels a little bit counterintuitive, but that actually the kinds of things that humans build for themselves when they wipe out the natural environment is actually also worse for the people. Like that we ourselves somehow need that kind of deeper integration, as you said, like hospitals embedded in the forest. Yeah, that's very.
And one last thing, which is, because we were so broke and because we also knew our neighborhood was going to be subject to a wealth disparity displacement, otherwise known as gentrification, there were people who made the argument, well, do you remember Just Green Enough? You remember when that was a thing? Don't make it too green, because then the people will come, all right? Well, we were like, the hell with that. We coined a phrase called garden-oriented development, or GOD. Yes, we're big on acronyms, big, get it? But the point here is very, very spiritually real for us, that it means everything to us to cultivate that relationship with our natural world.
That's delightful. Thank you so much, Naomi. Jill, why don't you tell us about your work?
Sure.
What drives you?
So what drives me? I was thinking about when you were sharing your backstory, how I never imagined that. Well, I didn't know as a kid this job even existed, so I never imagined, or I couldn't think about where I wanted to go as far as someday I want to be CEO in Arboretum. It was not in my world growing up where I did, and I was actually more of an arts and culture kid growing up. But I was constantly exposed. We were at the end of a subdivision next door to a farm field, so we'd be out in the field riding bikes, building forts in the field. We would go up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I grew up in Wisconsin, and we had a camp which was out in the woods, and my parents would be letting us play with fire, like grilling leaves. I could never imagine as a parent letting and they would just be like, good, go have fun, but I spent a lot of time outdoors, but my pathway was arts and culture. But when I arrived at college, when I look back, also sort of accidental, my job during college, probably took it from a biology student, was I ended up knowing someone who got me a job in a cancer research lab. So I ended up, my studies were political science, sort of more music, things like that, and yet I ended up working in a lab as my job and really got connected and sort of understood, took out the fear of science and that type of work. And I actually, sort of increased my responsibilities from glorified dishwasher or professional autoclaver to more things as I moved along. And when I graduated, I got my start at what's now the Peggy Nodebart Nature Museum. When I was there, it was the Chicago Academy of Sciences. And somehow, I was thinking I was in it because of arts and culture, but my pathway from there to here today has all been science-based cultural institutions. And what I found is that my skill set lies more on sort of the administration, the thinking about how do we get this out there, how do we tell that story, how do we help. How can I help support and advocate for the scientific community, the botanists, those people who are on the ground sort of doing that work, and I found that as my skill set.
Yeah, so what kind of story do you want people to learn?
Ooh, what kind of story? I think that story from college is a really interesting one. I think many students, many kids, if they were like me, when I took chemistry in high school, it was not my strong suit because I got really fearful, or I got a little bit afraid of what science meant because it was in a textbook, it seemed kind of scary and daunting. But once I was put in a lab working with people who were doing research actually on cows at the time related to cervical cancer, it was just like they would just hand me things and say, this is the step and this is the process, and it was really accessible, and I also really understood the purpose and the drive behind what they were doing. So I think where we start, and if I go to the Morton Arboretum, so I stand on really big shoulders.
Tell us about the Arboretum.
Yeah, so I stand on the shoulders of Joy Morton. I'm the fourth leader in the history of the organization. We're more than 100 years old.
Wow.
And Joy Morton, Morton Salt, if any were at the salt shed last night, that used to be where they stored salt, one of the buildings, and he founded the Arboretum on what was his original sort of country estate property. That, as time meant, in the early 1900s, his first wife was ill, so where did they go? They went to nature. They went out in the country at the time, which is now surrounded by expressway, but and for health and well-being. So they knew, right? He knew. And we are very fortunate that in that period, somehow Joy Morton had the vision when he was determining what his legacy would be. And he had a lot of choices, could have directed actually his trust and his estate to cancer research, interestingly enough, but he chose to create an arboretum. And what I think about at the time is now, if I think about the work and what we do, our mission, and we are literally part of, if you are a trustee of the Morton Arboretum, you are upholding the trust of Joy Morton, which is held at the State Attorney General's office. Our mission, the work we do, has not changed in more than 100 years. We have made the language a little bit more contemporary about a collection, a place where people can visit. We have significant science and conservation work in tree science, and we have urban and community forestry outreach education programs. Somehow he knew more than 100 years ago that this would be needed in this space. And he was given a little bit of a hard time about how far the Arboretum was from the city. Who in the world is gonna go 30 minutes from the city to visit an Arboretum? And now it's like, it's suburb, Arboretum, right? And it's not far away. So I stand on those shoulders and really thinking about when I was hired into this role 3 years ago, the board said, well, what we want you to do is to think about the next 100 years. It's like, it's really daunting.
Short and tree time.
Short, and also I'm like, a couple of my staff are here, they know, and I say this every day, I talk about Joy every day, because I'm trying to think about how was he thinking. He could not have actually known what we would need 100 years from now, and yet here he was creating this place where our vision is to create a greener, healthier, more beautiful world where people and trees thrive together. And how would we know that that would be as relevant and actually even more critically, urgently important today than 100 years ago? And so honestly, it's a big, you think about you shared your ancestral story. I don't know that I have that as specific as I do that I ended up here for a reason. And it was a path I didn't imagine, but I'm here. And now I have to think back to Joy Morton and how can I honestly just do my best to think about decisions you make every single day. We operate on tree time, so that's actually an interesting settling place for us. We have to be very patient, and the world isn't very patient these days.
It's hard to hurry up trees.
You can't hurry them up. They only grow so fast, although I was just sharing an article about there are some trees that they think are growing faster, but we'll see.
Okay.
But, and I don't know a lot about that. I actually was just sent the article this morning. But, it's interesting. So you end up in places where I think we all perhaps end up in places we might not have imagined. And now I just want to make this accessible. And I'm in a really interesting place in a public garden to sort of, the place itself can be a gateway, but we have to meet everyone where they're at. And they may not come at it from the place I came or someone else came, but it's our job to help bring them forward.
Great, thank you so much. All right, experiment number 3. Sika, tell us about what you're up to. And tell us a little bit about how you fell into this also.
Okay, I'm Siaka Stevens. I am the founder of Shebro Island City and the co-founder with Idris Elba of Shebro Alliance Partners, the development company behind the vision. So we have a public-private partnership with the government of Sierra Leone to develop Shebro Island. Shebro Island is literally a 230 square mile island off the coast of Sierra Leone. It's roughly the same size as Chicago. It's huge. It has a very small population. It's got beautiful natural assets. I think 30% of the island is mangroves, and it's got like 30 miles of pristine beach. And for us, we're focused on governance-led approach. So my grandfather was the former president of Sierra Leone. I was born in Sierra Leone, and Idris is half Sierra Leonean, but I spent most of my time in the UK. And my life was completely different. I was in luxury hospitality and entertainment. And I went back to Sierra Leone in 2015, and I realized, look, Sierra Leone has been one of the poorest countries for the last 30 years. There's not much economic growth and development. So I'm very creative, I always read a lot, and I thought, look, how can you help make your country self-reliant? I've traveled across the world with my entertainment business, and I've been to places like Dubai, and I've seen how good governance can really transform places that were once desert and barren. Good rules and regulations. So I thought, how can you do something like that in Sierra Leone? How can you help make a country self-reliant? And I stumbled randomly on Shebro Island. I never knew there was an island this size that existed off the coast of Sierra Leone. And I started researching and Googling. I thought, look, how do you build a new city? That's what I typed in on Google. Literally. And it's not as complex as you think. But I think for me, it was more about governance. Look, I think with places like Singapore, and especially the Asian countries, you can see that in a small period of time, there've been transformation in terms of economic growth. And Africa has issues in terms of attracting the level of investment we need. But when I looked more deeply into it, it was more for me, I focused on good governance. So what we structured with the government of Sierra Leone, which for those that are technical, last week it was ratified by the Parliament of Sierra Leone. So it's officially an act. And it's taken me 10 years to get to this point.
Bravo.
And Idris, thanks. And Idris and I partnered in 2019. So now it's very unique governance structure. So we have complete legislative and fiscal autonomy on that island. So we basically act like a quasi-semi-government within Sierra Leone, but we operate in a ring-fenced environment. And we're just focused on the governance and building the foundation to drive economic growth. Because if you look at Singapore, Dubai, all these places, the principles, forget the shiny buildings, it was the governance that attracted the investment into these areas. So that's what we've replicated to build that structure. It's been challenging, it's not been easy, but the foundations have been put in place.
So yeah, tell us a little bit about both what you have in mind in terms of attracting investment, and then also how you think of that in relation to these issues around ecology and climate as it's existing on the
So
island.
Climate was not my first priority in the beginning, but the more you looked at the natural assets of the island and the more I studied, for me it's about economic growth in harmony with nature. Our ancestors, we coexisted with the earth. And I think the advantage that we have, the huge advantage that we have, is we have a greenfield site, completely blank canvas. There's only 40,000 people on the island, and in comparison to the size of Chicago, which is, I think, 3 million people, 40,000 people is very small. And we've had a lot of stakeholder engagement, and they're very supportive of the project. You know, they have been from the beginning. The challenge was getting the government on side in terms of allowing that kind of fiscal and regulatory autonomy that you need, English common law, jurisdictions, all these things that really investors will look at favorably. But when it comes to the climate, look, I think one of the most exciting parts of the project, and especially speaking to lots of consultants and clients and partners, is like, you have the ability to build an eco-city, a green city from the start, not having to adjust to climate change or green buildings or whatever everyone's building now. We can do it, and we can build the legislation. And because we have the ability to write our own laws, we can take the best practices all over the world to implement them from the beginning in the outset. So I think that's the crucial part where our project slightly is a bit differentiated from other projects where we're working with a blank canvas, and how can you make this a green, sustainable model that can be replicated, especially across Africa. Africa needs new cities. It's a growing emerging continent. So for me, sustainability, working with people, and when a cities are for people. At the end of the day, we want a decent-sized population to live in cities, and we always measure an economic output in GDP per capita, but I think it's the well-being of citizens. That is the priority of what we're doing. So I think that's crucial for us. One of my favorite authors spoke about a country's spiritual vitality, and I look at a city's spiritual vitality. Are the people happy? Does it take you 2 hours to commute to work? You know, what Naomi was touching about is everything should be in a small radius, you know. But just to finish off, I wish I had some investors that were like you, that had a long-term 100-year, but, you know, we'll deal with that. I think we've built the foundations in place to move on to the next steps. And like I said, the toughest part was getting the government to agree to this, which they have done, and ratification by Parliament 2 weeks ago was a huge milestone. So now it's about collaborations and partnerships to move this place forward. And Shebro is a beautiful, if you Google SHERBRO, Shebro Island, it's incredible. It's an incredible place.
It's every time you and I have had a conversation, I always think about like what it would have been like to be one of these like city planners for New York or something, like back when they're like, oh no, there's like some cow fields over there that we should like put a square around.
Right.
It's like an amazing opportunity that you have.
And that's what it is, to showcase. that you can, because I was a little bit worried. Look, my priority was kind of economic growth, poverty eradication. And I said to someone, look, can you have both economic growth and, you know, the considerations for nature equally? And he said, yes, it can be done. And there's technologies out there now that show it can be done. You don't have to damage the environment. Like I said, 30% of the island is mangroves. So we don't want to damage that. But then we have to talk about, when you talk about, like, for example, I've got this in my notes. So we talk about like the people and the citizens. We need to cover the basics. You know, you can't talk about sustainability if people can't eat. You know, especially in Africa where that's a real problem. I see sand mining and people destroying trees and mangroves, but if they can't feed themselves, and it becomes challenging. So that's why economic growth is so important, and education as well. So we spend a lot of time talking to the people about not cutting down the mangroves, trying to use more sustainable things that they used in cooking. So it's interesting, challenging but interesting.
That's great. Yeah, please, Jill.
You know, I was thinking about, and I would actually charge that a lot of us probably think about this. How is the work that we do, or if we're I'm very specific in the world of trees and plants, so woody plants, trees, but within that broader space of climate and nature. And we might have talked about this a little bit, but this idea of, we know people need the basic human needs of sort of food, clothing, and shelter, but yet how do we move in that, like nature, and you were talking about this, it's not an amenity. No. It's not a nice to have. And I think that is really challenging in the work and space that we're in, because we need to take care of basic needs, but honestly, at the foundation, if the natural world, you know, the trees, plants, the space around us isn't taken care of, all of those basic human needs are even harder to achieve. You know, so if you're natural, it's harder to achieve positive health. Yeah. It's harder to achieve food security if you don't have access to, I don't know if you have a food forest down in your
We're in the process. We have a series of gardens that we're using for specific utilitarian, cultural, and participatory access by neighbors. So we've planted the trees, but we've also planted a fruit and nut orchard called the Orchard of the Ancestors. And we are this year building in our first production gardens. So farming is different from community gardening, is different from botanical gardening. And we frankly have had a focus on how do you make things look beautiful, which has not been a food production focus. But we've always maintained what we call a demonstration garden behind our headquarters, the green living room, a little bit of a paradise in and of itself. Take your shoes off, sit and have a glass of wine or whatever. And but the idea that we are messengers for the good habit of producing your own food. And we haven't given up on our backyard garden campaign.
That's good. Jill, talk a little bit about what are the kinds of people that come and visit? What are their motivations? Why are they there?
Oh, why are they there? So the Morton Arboretum, I would say, is,
and how large is it? Like,
so the Morton Arboretum is 1,700 acres, 900 of which we'd call natural areas. We have an accessioned collection. I think it's more than 40,000 trees. So accessioned meaning we're like a museum collection. We know that tree, we know where it is, we know its provenance. And then we do have, our head of collections calls it original equipment, but there are trees that we did not plant who are in our space as well. But we have more than 1 million visitors that visit the Arboretum place, sort of the Arboretum grounds, on an annual basis. And the challenge that I have is, first of all, it's 1,700 acres. So if you come to visit and you ask me to show you the Arboretum in an hour, I can't. I'm just telling you, I'll show you a postage stamp slice. But we have more than 1 million visitors, and we also have
that's a huge number.
It's a huge number. Yeah. And but we have very different audience. So the majority of those 1 million visitors are probably, to the chagrin perhaps of many, but not to me, who, you know, they might think they're just here to see an exhibition, or they're just here to come to our children's garden. They're not coming necessarily, most likely, to learn about trees. But what they are coming for is, and this is the #1 reason people visit the Arboretum, because they go into this space that they know is an incredible space to be in, to be with their family, to be with their friends, or maybe to be on their own if they need a contemplative space or a healing space. So what we have to really understand is it is that gateway, and that is really okay. And even though there are also a much smaller segment who might come, a professional community, a scientific community, who literally comes because we use our collection for scientific and research and conservation purposes as well. We're unique because we are an entirely private organization. We have no public funding, well, maybe a very small portion of public funding that supports our operating budget. So we have a real opportunity to use our space and use our collection and demonstration and without having to worry about what other people might want from that property. So
I want to segue
really
to
close
that
to what you're saying.
because we also have a partnership with Argonne
Right.
Labs, and so we use some of our parcels to collect data, to collect climate data, to collect water table data. When you talked about contemplative spaces,
Yeah.
some of you know that Blacks and Green is the owner of the Emmett and Mamie Till House Museum in Westwood Lawn, and half a block down the street, we've cultivated the Mamie Till Forgiveness Garden. Obviously, she's famous globally for the incredible act of forgiveness that she blessed the murderers of her son with, and the idea that we have created a garden specifically for the purpose of meandering and the aromatics that we're planting, the herbal healing garden that we're planting, and just the winding mounds and a water feature we're bringing in this year. It's this idea that take a beat and just sit and let nature be a healing force for you.
And again, that's like breaking down this nature-culture divide in a very dramatic way. Like it's clear that humans are embedded and belong to nature.
And we don't believe in fences, but just don't tell the city of Chicago.
There's a question here. Can you pull a mic? And just tell us who you are also when you...
Hi, my name is Dana. I am a proud member of the Morton Arboretum.
Thank you.
And I hike there several times a week. Thank you, grateful member as well. I have a question for you and your work at the Morton. I have a question for you, Ms. Davis, and your work with the garden, and I will soon be visiting the Forgiveness Garden. That's just brilliant. When we think of biophilia, when we think of creating these beautiful places, or making room for these beautiful places, we often imagine them as sunlit, daylight places. I'll reveal my bias as a dark sky advocate with the International Dark Sky Organization. Are you also imagining those places at night? Because when we are asleep, the world comes alive. Trees depend upon deep darkness to thrive. We know that artificial light will actually shorten the life of a tree. We know that birds require darkness to roost and thrive. We know they also require darkness to successfully migrate. They depend upon the moon, and we confuse them with our bright lights. Insects as well.
That's great. Yeah, thank you.
So how, I don't know that we're doing specific work related to darkness. So that's actually a very interesting question.
It really is.
I'll say today that I'm going to take that in and take that back. So thank you. And so I think that I'll take that in and take that back, but I do think it is thinking about that holistic picture of the challenge of all of the spaces that we're working in when they're in an urban environment, that it is a very complicated space to work in, because not only are we dealing with light, but I know we're dealing with, you know this well, we're surrounded by 88, 355, Butterfield. We are surrounded by traffic, literally on two sides expressway, and subdivisions. And there are all these additional weights that press on us. I mean, we're a little bit fortunate because of our scale that most of the time you can't hear the traffic that much or have that impact of, but there's a lot to think about, and I appreciate you bringing up the light question. I haven't thought of that.
And I want to address that too, because maybe you should come out and consult with us, because at night the Mamie Till Forgiveness Garden is absolutely pitch black, invisible. And I'm kind of like,
so interesting.
you know, how, and the team and I are talking about it. It's like light has always been a feature that we expected to introduce, but not like lights, but, you know, maybe, you know, and of course we're looking at what the solar inventory, what those options are. But how do you position them so that they highlight things? We've got these beautiful permeable pavement pathways, you know, where, because the, you know, runoff, stormwater, and that consciousness. But just to make it inviting, to make it lovely, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts.
And I'll just say, I have a gift because of my role. I am often at the Arboretum. We open our gates at 7 a.m. I have been known to be walking well before 7 a.m. And it's a very interesting space because of the quietness and the life that's out, especially the wildlife, that we sometimes come upon each other and are a little bit startled when we see each other. But it's a very interesting thing to think about those places when they, what else is there that we don't always get a chance to see because of night or other hours.
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about Africa in this way, I'm interested in how much do you feel like there's a healthy, intact relationship between how people are living and the natural environment that they're in Shebro already?
Yeah.
And how much can you build on that as you build the city versus introducing kind of external ecological visions from elsewhere?
Yeah, I think most of Africa is underdeveloped anyway, so communities and people are actually very used to living with their surroundings. So one of the things that made very clear to the local stakeholders is we don't intend to disrupt anything, and built into our model is something called the Shebro Community Trust. So our company, we own kind of exclusive development rights over the entire island, but the actual lands are vested in the community. So the communities have the say in terms of what they want to see, and there's a special fund that's been set up for projects for the local community. So I think it's a priority. Me being a Sierra Leonean and doing this project to benefit the people of Sierra Leone, it's imperative that the locals have a say in this and what we're doing. So I think the next few chapters are going to be interesting. Like, we're always looking to work with collaborators and forward-thinking people in this field because, look, we're literally building a mini country from scratch, in essence.
Yeah, talk about like what are some of the things that you're finding most difficult? What are the obstacles? What feels very hard at the moment? And what can people help with? I
think what the difficulty is, normally a sovereign government will take on the initial infrastructure because although the island was part of the island was a former British colony, so there's a random British telephone box on the island. It's just random. It's got amazing history. Yeah, like, and they built a kind of town, and there's a landing strip that needs to be refurbished. But normally, a sovereign government will take on the initial infrastructure funding. You know, they would do that part, and then the private sector will come in. I think the challenge is with the ratification is finding those partners, the patient capital, to come in at this early stage. So I think that's been a challenge. But I think if we can overcome the difficulties dealing with the government of Sierra Leone, I think we'll be okay.
Yeah, good. I do actually mean that people should jump in when you feel like, please.
Because I had a question, which is, okay, so how are you seeing the interface between the built and the natural? And what do you know that you're definitely not going to do? And, you know, it's like...
Yeah, that's great.
And what is it? Do you have a vision that's already been... I'm so curious.
So we coined as an Afro-dynamic eco-city, okay? So what we don't want to do, we're not destroying the national habitat, we're not destroying the mangroves, okay? But how do you work around what's there already, and how do you enhance it? You know, we actually need to protect, even though the island is quite big, but rising sea levels are actually a factor. They're under our kind of development. Shebro Island is the development zone. There are some smaller islands that are located, that are in the zone that we need to protect. So I think the next stage of the planning is where the excitement comes in with a real specialist in this field. How do we kind of articulate the kind of long-term vision, but in a phased approach that we don't plan on disrupting any of the natural habitats? You know, and there's something called the Turtle Islands. You know, I think there's dolphins on the coast of the island. So how can we create this economic growth and, you know, poverty eradication, but then working alongside nature to do that and make Shebro, look, I've always said it should be a place where people live, work, play, and retire. We have a lot of our African American diaspora that live outside the continent. My mother and her friends, they're at retirement homes, and they want to go back to Sierra Leone, but they're not going back
I'll
to
have
Sierra
a
Leone.
parcel.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You see, so that's, and 100% you should do. I think everyone's idea is, for me, this is a collaborative project. We have a clean slate when all the best people, the best ideas in the world say, look, you should think about doing this and think about doing that. And then we can take this model, a greenfield site, and then really something we can replicate across the rest of the continent.
Do you have housing materials there on the island?
No. Everything is completely.
Wow.
That's the next. That's the next.
That's
stage.
next.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's where the exciting part comes in.
Now, Idris is exhausted.
Yeah. So at the moment, one of the challenges is it's quite remote, but it's not far from the mainland in terms of, I think the closest is 15-minute boat ride. So, but it's far from the capital. And because there's no bridge, you can only go there by boat, it's been a bit isolated. So one of our things in the early stages is to refurbish. We've got a landing strip that the Brits built during World War II. It needs to be refurbished and extended. So you fly to the main airport and then fly to Shebro, and it's a boat ride away. So there's these challenges that we have to overcome.
And I mean, you said you had a very interesting conversation with British Airways about
Yes,
about this.
yeah. So we've spoken to lots of interested parties. So British Airways, for example, the CEO, myself and Idris had a conversation with him, and he said, look, Siaka, if this project starts to take off, we know that we're going to get huge uptake in flight interest, business travelers, consultants. So we don't mind flying to a destination and taking a loss on that for 5 years, but knowing that as this project develops, we know you're going to have consistent, BA can fly to Sierra Leone for 25 years. So it's a case of showcasing these projects and allowing these kind of companies to say, okay, look, this is something we believe in, we're going to start flying to Sierra Leone, because I think the last time British Airways flew to Sierra Leone, it was just before Ebola, and there was London Mining, a big mining company, so they were full with business class.
Yeah.
You know, so it's just a case about just justifying that kind of economic element of it, which is hugely important to get the ball rolling. And once it starts, I do believe it will snowball.
That's great. Okay, we have a question here. You should be okay.
Okay. Hi, I'm Megan.
Say your name.
Yes, I'm Megan. I'm a researcher at Stanford right now within urban studies and architecture. So a lot of the work that you're doing is very interesting to me. I'm curious, so I guess in a city planning sense, like having a blank slate is like the most ideal kind of circumstance that you could have. Earlier when you were speaking about the work that's happening in Dubai or in the Middle East, I'm thinking about projects like The Line, which obviously also have like a lot of discourse around them of like energy usage and material usage that's going into like the middle of the desert to build also an eco-village. Like, could you speak more tangibly about like what are practices that you are implementing after doing a lot of like research and development and a lot of across other cities of how you're mitigating some of those things, how you're not just bringing in more materials and like et cetera, and yeah, how you're thinking about some of those issues?
So I think we've done a pre-feasibility study, and the next phase is to do the actual in-depth studies. We're working with a number of world-class consultants on that step. Look, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a phased approach. But what we have done is we've actually partnered with the UK's largest energy company called Octopus Energy. So they are building some renewable wind farms on the island in the initial stages. So I think the next process is working with all these companies to actually lay down the final master plan and actually how do we build this out in the most sustainable manner over a period of time. And that's where we're at now. I can't answer some of these questions because the studies have not been done yet. But I think we have the ability to, like I said, we've got a greenfield site, and for a developer or master planner, it's great. We're not working alongside legacy infrastructure. So the next stage is the exciting part. How do you do this, and how do you work with the environment, and how do you get the most sustainable building materials and the most sustainable practices in place from the beginning. And we can, because we have that legislative autonomy, which is hugely important, we can embed these into the laws of Shebbro Island from the beginning. And that's the actual next step, is actually, now the ratification's happened, we have to submit the enabling legislation. What are the laws that govern Shebbro Island? So these are all the things, and all the experts will draw in to take the best practices from all over the world, because it's an English common law jurisdiction. That's what we've negotiated with the government. So we can take the best practices from Singapore, America, all English common law jurisdictions, and implement them into our legal system for the island.
That's great.
So I have something to add related to that question. I've been thinking about this a lot, and so first of all, we're an arboretum, but we are so much more than that place. In fact, it's not about the Arboretum, it's not about us, because as a nonprofit, it's about the work that we do. It's actually about the work that we're doing with Naomi and others that's not about our place. It's how we're doing things that are transferable, the science, the conservation, how we get people connected to trees in their environment. It's about what's outside of us. That's the real important impact, right? It's not about the 1 million visitors, by the way. That's a good stat. It's a nice stat. It just means that many people were hopefully given a taste. But as I think about, I'm really struggling with when you're thinking about urban planning and city planning and how we're building communities and addressing really critical issues within cities like Chicago or any size city around the country, around the world, that nature often isn't at the table when we're thinking about who should be sitting around the table when we're coming up with a civic community plan about how to address key societal issues. And I just had this experience where there's a great plan that's coming out, but I looked at all of the voices, and there weren't voices. There were maybe even philanthropic or cultural voices, but nature wasn't at the table. And environment, trees weren't at the table in my world. And I'm thinking about, as we're thinking about how we're gonna solve critical issues just within the city of Chicago, we have to start thinking about the green space as a critical voice to have when we're trying to solve health issues, crime issues, food security issues, just good, beautiful spaces to live. Because it's, and I go back to this amenity comment, I think we're often thought of as once we build the city, then we'll figure out where to plant the garden, where to plant the tree to make it pretty. But it's actually not about being pretty. It's about being a core part. And I always think about this. We've seen this in some of the horrific impacts of climate change in urban, rural, across the country, around the world. Nature always wins. So we can plan whatever way we want in our city, but ultimately nature, especially now with extreme events, needs to be at the table from the very beginning, or even if we're already in a built space. And so I'm thinking about that a lot these days, and it's not even about my voice necessarily being at the table is like me, but I know that I know a lot of people who I could say, where's the science, where's the nature voice sitting at that urban landscape, urban design, or city planning table. And it's a new way of thinking. And I actually think in the public garden world, I'm actually thinking a lot about this next 100 years, how we just have to also not be a place to visit, because we actually never have been just that. But we have to reposition how we're thinking about a lot of things, including the work we're doing across the field and in many of our spaces. We have to think differently about what role we should be playing. And I think about that a lot when it comes to urban and city design. More and more people are living in cities, and yet the voice of nature isn't at the table in planning.
So I want to come back to that in just a second, but first I want to ask you a question actually, which is related, which is one of the things that's really struck me in this conversation and in our previous conversations about this is the role of human vulnerability or fragility. So part of, I think, what creates such a strong nature versus culture divide is an attempt to kind of buffer ourselves, to say like, okay, we need to stay safe on this side of the line. And so then you build kind of infrastructure and artificial environments in all kinds of respects. It seems to me like you're experimenting with something that works very differently than that. And I'm curious, like, can you just set out a couple of like those alternative principles about like what kind of humanity do you have to inhabit to want to do the kind of project that you're doing?
Well, we want to slow life down a little bit and have people, there was a time when in the earlier days in West Woodlawn when we were partnering with Morton that we would do monthly tree walks. And we'd have about 25 people, grandmothers down to grandchildren, young men, and it was really it surprised me every month. It was an astounding mix of people who were interested. And how to sustain that when you're a tiny organization and the time and money it takes to do those has been an ongoing challenge. But what we know for sure is that there's an appetite, there's an interest. Not to mention the birds that live in those trees. And we have a hawk family that lives across the street from my house. And, you know, the apps that you can get for the bird calls and this, that, and the other. The idea that we went around with Morton and did an inventory of every tree in West Woodlawn. What have we got? Well, we know we've got an overabundance of the sugar maples, and we're not going to be planting any of those. But how do we reforest on the regular? Because trees, while they will outlive us much of the time, they do have a life cycle like everything on the planet. And how are we planning for that? The idea that we are looking at how to have our neighbors understand what is typically known in the field like the 12 or 17 values of trees, you know. We're so happy to announce, I got my buddies from the city and MPC here today to announce we're planting 50 new trees on Cottage Grove. It is a heat island. Yay, guys. It is a heat island. Heat island, heat kills, okay? Not only does heat kill your body, but it kills your business. Where would you rather shop? I was down in Atlanta on business over the weekend, and it was like, get me to some shade. I can't stand it out here. It's too hot. And when you go down Cottage Grove, you'll get in your air conditioner car and go home or go to the next community before you'll keep walking down a street with no trees. Right? So there are the studies that have to do with violence. That a botanic haven is a safe haven against those kind of violent tendencies and behaviors. There's all of the, you know, the health data, and then there is that tension, as we talked about the lights, the tension between the need for dark and the need for light. There's the tension between I don't want no trees in my front yard, okay? And because the roots are gonna destroy my plumbing system. And how do we have those conversations? And how do we do that education? And how do we do that mitigation in a way that we're living with the built environment in harmony? And and I'll say this again regarding the tension and the balance is that we are acquiring more land. We're in the process of acquiring more land in West Woodlawn, and the neighbors want affordable housing. And as God would have it, we have an award-winning affordable housing design, which we're raising capital for now, but the plan has always been to continue acquiring parcels for a greenway that we're building through the neighborhood. Because, you know, if you can get out and walk in a beautiful setting, if rather than the nasty alleys and the just random lots, you had this oasis trailing through your neighborhood, how good would it feel to be out and hearing the birds and meeting with your neighbors? So, you know, we do have an agenda that we have spent a lot of time investing in. We do have a way that we are going to continue to work with Morton on our arboretum, because I think we would be the first community-based Arboretum, and we're 2 miles as the crow flies from where the Obama Presidential Center is coming up. Tourism. We want people to come to our walkable village and discover an oasis, discover a Black community that represents beauty and prosperity and comfort and joy.
We've got one question here.
Thank you. I'm Heather Navarro. I'm with the Midwest Climate Collaborative, and thank you for sharing that vision, Naomi. One of the questions I have, so I live in St. Louis, and I hear this from a lot of the communities I work with around the Midwest. After an extreme weather event, we were just recently hit with a tornado, and a lot of my neighbors, don't want to see another tree. It crushed their car, it came through their living room window, and the neighborhoods that were hit the hardest are the ones with the fewest resources to respond to this. And so we've been having a lot of conversations about tree maintenance. It's easy to find volunteers and funding and saplings. People love going out and planting trees. But in 10, 15 years, it's roots in the sewer lines, but it's also these extreme weather events, the maintenance. And so I'm curious, who's helping fund that, and what are the solutions to successful long-term maintenance programs, which are ultimately going to lower insurance bills too, because insurance companies are looking, and if you've got a really nice, big, beautiful tree next to your home, your premiums are going up. So how do we reconcile all of this for long-term tree and human health?
So I think this is a really interesting question, because I'll say trees are really easy and they're really hard in this way. So if you think about what can I do for the environment? One of the answers is, I'll plant a tree, right? Like plant a tree, and typically it's a tree. Oftentimes perhaps it's not even planted correctly, but it seems easy. And I think instead of focusing, we should focus on planting lots of trees, but it's sort of about that, but it's more about, are we thinking really about that tree that's already established has much more value, right? And it's that caring and maintenance that's the hardest thing. And I'll say, if you're in the, nonprofit world and you fundraise, I will say this is the equivalent to saying, please help provide general operating support for our organization, right?
Yes.
So, right, yeah, and it's the same thing with care and maintenance of trees. So what we have to do is notice what's there, understand actually if this tree is causing damage to infrastructure, perhaps it wasn't put in the right place, or perhaps that infrastructure was added in a place without taking into consideration that this tree would grow and get larger and could have these impacts. So I think it's hard, because we're not, and maybe I'm going to go back to my thing of, we're not at the table when we're having these conversations about how to build communities, and you have such an opportunity and build places where you're thinking about that integration from the start. And then I'll also say with insurance, I'll just take insurance. I also think organizations like the Arboretum or any other organization has to start working with sort of what might be unlikely partners. Maybe we'd say the insurance industry doesn't like trees, but you're right, actually, trees can be very beneficial to the insurance industry or to the cost of living if they're managed correctly. So it's also all of us thinking differently about not saying this is a bad partner and this is a good partner. It's like we're all in this world together. So how do we work together to make those decisions?
And just on that financial thing, I always find myself skeptical of those arguments, in part because, I live in DC, and you can stand on the roof of our office and look through the city, and the parts that are wealthy are full of trees,
right,
and the other parts aren't. And it's just completely
Doesn't
obvious.
make any sense.
And so you think, well, the people with the insurance pens are probably still assessing this situation correctly in that part of the city.
Right.
Okay, so we have 2 minutes left. I'd love to hear each of you just say 1 to 2 things that you think are most pressingly important for you about how you kind of renegotiate this relationship, and what you need. What is it that would be actually most valuable for you as you kind of continue to do this work? Do you want to start? Or?
Yeah, sure. In my case, I think it's just partnerships, and also fundraising capital. I've always said, I think, Jill touched on, we have a great opportunity to showcase, and it's kind of, you can use it as a way to showcase other people how to do things or how to take into consideration, because from what we've just spoken about, in terms of how you plant the trees and who maintains them, I never thought of that. But that's going to stick into my mind now when it comes to master planning. Yeah, make sure these trees don't knock this house down. But I think that's very important on my side of things. Yeah,
that's great.
I'll just be additive because I think that's really important. I think one thing that I've heard today is, first of all, partnership, that no one organization can do any of this work alone. Yeah. And you have to think about that diversity and collaborate, diversity
within
that momentum. Partnership, getting momentum. Yeah. And the other thread that I've been thinking about a lot, and I heard it in the session I went earlier, is we are doing it. Are we allowing, not only do I want the voice of nature at the table, but are we also being really deliberate about bringing in the youth, the younger generation of voices to the table? Because first of all, they care, and there are a lot of great ideas, and we really need to be open to inviting their voice to the table early and bigger. So I think, how do we bring that younger voice to the table? And those are probably two things that I'm thinking, adding to what.
That's great.
And I can build on that and say, years ago, when I first began planting trees in the neighborhood, I early on also experienced the heartbreak of seeing newly planted trees die young. Why? Because they must be watered. They must be watered deeply and regularly. And then they must be pruned. And then, when you have a tree well and you have weeds that are a foot high surrounding the tree, it's a bitter experience. And then to learn in tandem with that you have a whole generation of arborists retiring and leaving a huge gap in the market. When a kid can come out of high school and earn $30,000 in his first year or her first year maintaining trees. It's not a workforce track that we have properly cultivated. And I've done a few little job fairs around trees, and I just want to do a lot more of that. We have, tree keepers from open lands and their course, very high intensity course, but there are all kinds of ways to get into the business of caring for trees. And of course, at Blacks and Green, we're economic developers, environmental economic developers. So finding the resources, the partnerships, to get the message out, to do the work. People are not going to turn off their TVs, go outside and stare at a tree and wonder what they can do to help that tree just on their own. And even when Morton can take us around and help us analyze the health of a tree and have fun with families doing that, you still need staff. You still need the resources to pay a staff. You need the partnerships. You need that ongoing. And if you stop, and people remember, 5 years ago, yeah, I remember you were doing that. But if you can keep it going, and you can keep it growing.
Yeah, that's great.
Can I add one more thing? I think it's also, I'm thinking a lot about this community thing, and it's about really meeting people where they're at, though, because if there are lots of people who will not and don't think about trees or plants in the natural world because they have other things that are for them, just have greater value for whatever their personal experience is. But I think it doesn't mean, we just have to be comfortable with that and meet them where they're at. If it is only about a tree being pretty, that's okay. Yeah. If it is only about one thing, or if they don't, it's okay that they just want to visit the Arboretum for whatever purpose they have, to spend time on a date or to come see an exhibition. That's really okay, and I'm hoping that that one piece will lead to another down the road. And I think about, I never knew where I would end up, and I'm not sure I understood. I didn't know. Yeah. So I think if we start with everyone with where they're at and just say that's where they're at, and I'm going to meet you there, and I'm going to meet other people further along the line. But I think that's really important.
All right, thanks to our brilliant panel. Thanks all of you. Make sure to water your trees.